coming in and they're entering in from the waiting room, we're going to just give it a quick pause, make sure that everyone can move over. And so while we are doing that, I want to welcome everybody to our First Five Nebraska and our look at the Child Care and Development Fund as we take a look at the final rule and what it means for Nebraska's 2025-2027 state plan. And so, again, welcome everyone. I do want to make sure that we do recognize our CLC interpreter, B. Torres. And B, I guess if you would like to give some instructions for the room here.
Of course. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is B. My pronouns are she, her, ella, and I will be your interpreter with the Community Language Cooperative. And I want to thank you for your commitment to language justice. Language justice means that everyone should have the right to speak in the language of their heart. To achieve this today, we'll be using Zoom's interpretation function, and we'll activate that in a moment. At that time, you'll see a globe icon at the bottom of your screen. You'll click on that globe icon and select either English or Spanish as the language of your heart. If you are fully bilingual, you don't need to choose a language. I want to remind folks to please remember to speak at a conversational pace so that I'm able to provide an accurate rendition of your message. And should you have any issues with the interpretation function, please don't hesitate to type in the chat and we can troubleshoot as we go. I'll repeat this in Spanish and then we can get started. Hola, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Vi Torres, mi pronombre es ella y yo seré su intérprete con la Cooperativa Comunitaria de Lenguaje o la CLC. Les agradecemos su compromiso con la justicia del lenguaje, lo cual significa que todos tenemos el derecho de hablar en el idioma de nuestro corazón. En un momento activaremos la función de interpretación y aparecerá un globo terráqueo en la pantalla de Zoom. Favor de hacer clic en ese icono y elija inglés o español como el idioma de corazón. Si usted es bilingüe, no es necesario escoger un idioma. Les recuerdo que por favor hablen a un ritmo de conversación para poder brindar una interpretación precisa de su mensaje. Si tienen cualquier problema con la interpretación, no dude de escribir en el chat y lo averiguaremos mientras seguimos con la reunión. Muchas gracias. Ya comenzaremos. Thank you very much. We can go ahead and activate interpretation now.
All right, so the interpretation channel should be activated. So if you would like to go ahead and make sure of which channel you would prefer to hear our webinar in, go ahead and select that now. Otherwise, again, welcome to First Five Nebraska, our webinar for the Child Care and Development Fund, a look at the final rule and Nebraska State Plan. My name is Mike Feakin. I'm the Strategic Partnerships Advisor for First Five Nebraska. And so I will be monitoring our chat channel and just want to make sure that everyone is aware that we are going to be putting in several different links throughout that. And then also, we also have Jody Renee Giron. She will be monitoring our chat channel on the Spanish channel. So if you have any questions, please make sure that you put them in the chat, as we will make sure that that our channels will be muted. And so please go ahead and make sure that you put any questions in the chat, and we will get to them as we're going. But now, it is now my privilege and honor to welcome to the Zoom stage our Policy Research Manager, Dr. Katie Bass, as she explains what the heck CCDF and what's going on with it and what are we doing here. So please take it away, Dr. Bass.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you so much for that fantastic introduction. I hope I live up to it as we go through today's webinar. We're going to talk about, as Mike said, the 2024 Child Care and Development Fund rule changes and how Nebraska's CCDF state plan responds to those rule changes. So in order to do that, I want to start by just defining some of the terms we're going to be using throughout this conversation. And the first one is CCDF. And what that is the Child Care and Development Fund. The Child Care and Development Fund is a federal and state partnership program. Sometimes you'll hear folks refer to CCDBG, and that's the Child Care and Development Block Grant. That's the law that authorizes the CCDF. Oftentimes you'll hear people use them interchangeably, but they do have some differences. And what CCDF does is it provides financial assistance to low-income families so that they have access to childcare. What we often refer to this as in Nebraska is the child care subsidy. So CCDF is the fund that is funding our child care subsidy system in the state. In addition to child care assistance, there are also additional investments in quality that are funded through CCDF. Next, let's talk about the final rule. A lot of you may have seen our sort of call to action last June when the Federal Administration for Children and Families announced that they would be making updates to the regulations around childcare subsidy. Those updates are were announced in June. There was a public comment period on those updates, and they were finalized in March of 2024. Those updates became effective April 30th, 2024. But I want to be very clear here. That does not mean that those rules become effective in that moment. It means that they apply to the next round of CCDF state and territory plans. Don't worry, we're going to define that term as well in just a moment. So the law became effective, or the rules became effective on April 30th, 2024, and they apply to the forthcoming CCDF state and territory plans. The changes in the final rule are intended to lower costs of childcare for families, improve payment practices for childcare providers, increase the options for childcare for families who access childcare through the childcare subsidy system, and reduce some of the bureaucracy that is involved in the application process and the administration process. The final rule, as it's published, does a couple of different things. First, it outlines what states are required to do. Some of the final rule changes are not requirements, but clarifications of what states and territories are allowed to do or encouraged to do. And in other instances, the published final rule clarifies some practices that were already present, but that there may have been some miscommunications between the federal government and states. And so that final rule does those three different things. It's also important to say that included in the language of the CCDF state plans, states can apply for a temporary transitional waiver in order to waive certain new requirements that are part of the CCDF final rule. So let's talk about what the state plan is and what Nebraska's state plan is. State plans serve as the application for CCDF funds. So Nebraska has developed and published their draft state plan. This plan is due to the Administration of Children and Families on July 1st of 2024, and if approved, would become effective on October 1st, 2024. One important step of a state plan development is that the state plan draft is made available for public comment. In Nebraska, the state plan public hearing will be on June 24th, 2024. This is the opportunity for the public to comment on the state plan as drafted and as published. At the end of today's webinar, we will in fact give you the very specific information on how to make public comments on that plan. We also do want to say that Nebraska, much like many other states, will be requesting a temporary transitional waiver for some of the requirements, the new requirements in the CCDF final rule. So what I'm going to do now is step through each of the new changes in the final rule and how Nebraska's state plan, draft state plan, addresses those changes. The first set of changes are around childcare affordability. The CCDF final rule requires that co-payments for families be capped at 7% of family income, regardless of how many children there are in the family. The maximum a family co-payment should be is 7% of the family's income. Nebraska's CCDF draft state plan meets this requirement, and Nebraska is one of a handful of states who has met this requirement for some time. This before was encouraged. It is now required. The CCDF final rule also allows states to waive co-payments for families below 150% of the federal poverty level. This is not a requirement. This is something that is allowed and encouraged. And in Nebraska, the draft state plan waives co-payments for families who are below 100% of the federal poverty level. So not 150%, but 100%. The next requirement is that states post information about the co-payments, including the specific amounts that families can expect to pay based on their income level to their website. Nebraska's CCDF draft state plan meets the requirements of posting information on the sliding fee scale. But right now, the website does not currently contain the co-payment amounts. It simply states what the income eligibility criteria are for the different categories of eligibility. Co-payment amounts are not on the website. The next group of changes are on expanding parent choice and provider stability. The CCDF final rule requires the use of grants and contracts for slots for children in underserved geographic areas, infants and toddlers, and children with disabilities. Nebraska's draft state plan does not meet this requirement and states that Nebraska will be seeking out technical assistance to help implement this new change. The CCDF final rule requires child care providers to be paid prior to or at the beginning of the delivery of service. This is called prospective payments. This is a typical payment practice for families who pay privately for childcare, that you pay for the week before the week begins. Nebraska's draft CCDF plan does not meet this requirement and states that Nebraska will request a waiver and seek technical assistance in order to meet this requirement in the future. The CCDF final rule also requires that payments be based on a child's authorized enrollment, and that attendance-based payments are no longer allowed. In Nebraska, we do have an attendance-based payment system, and the current state plan draft does not meet this new requirement of the CCDF final rule, and once again states that Nebraska will request a waiver. An additional clarification in the CCDF final rule is that states can pay higher than market or private pay rates. And this is an emphasis here is if that is to improve quality or as an incentive for quality. Nebraska, while this is not a requirement, Nebraska does do this. We do have payments that exceed market rates for children with special needs and for programs who receive a rating of 3 or higher in Step Up to Quality. So while not a requirement, Nebraska does use this payment practice.
Katie, we have a couple of questions here that, and maybe they pertain to these particular slides. So I guess the one for maybe this particular one, the question from Shannon is, are they requiring a waiver for the full amount of years that can be granted? And I'm not entirely sure exactly what, maybe you know what that means.
So the right now, what the federal government allows is a temporary waiver for this particular state plan. It is my understanding that yes, the waiver would be for the full amount of time that this plan is in place.
Okay, and then because of this next prior or the next year's plan or the 2025-2027 plan, do they can they request waivers from previous plans? I think maybe is that Erica, that might be her question is, can they request waivers for ongoing requirements that have not been adhered to before?
At this point, Nebraska meets all of the requirements of the 2016 final rule, which is the one that is in place for all previous plans.
Okay.
So there would be no waiver available for previous plans that Nebraska would be seeking out.
Okay. So a clarification, they could get a waiver and not have to meet the final rule?
That is correct. Thank you, Mike. When I'm presenting, I can't always catch the chat, so please feel free to pop in again if there's another thing I need to address. And then we can also address questions at the end. The next group of changes are around expanding access to subsidy and reducing bureaucracy. So an allowable option in the CCDF final rule, so not a requirement, but allowed and encouraged, is to utilize presumptive eligibility for families. This means that a family can be eligible when they have some, but not all of their documentation verified. Right? So if they meet the requirements, but not everything is verified, the state can make rules to allow for presumptive eligibility. And again, states would have a lot of leeway in how they utilize presumptive eligibility. In Nebraska's state plan, presumptive eligibility is available for families who are participating in the employment first activities, and these are TANF activities. So it is for a specified population, but in that instance, presumptive eligibility is utilized in Nebraska. The CCDF final rule also allows simplified eligibility verification through coordination with similar programs. So what this means is that if you are applying for a benefits program that is not child care subsidy, but the agency still has your income information, has documentation that you've submitted for a different application, they can coordinate across programs so that you do not have to send the same documents over and over again. And Nebraska does have this coordination on documentation through programs where you enroll through NFocus. So that is an option, right? Through programs that work through NFocus, which is a Nebraska system. The CCDF final rule also allows states to align household eligibility to the addition of a new child. So what this would mean is that when a baby is born or a family adopts or begins fostering a family, we should not see that one child have a different eligibility period than the rest of the children in the family. Currently, Nebraska does align the entire household. However, that alignment is with the children that were already in the family. The new CCDF rules encourage that the alignment be with the new child. So what that would do would be extending the time period that the families, before the family has to have their eligibility redetermined. Nebraska's state plan does state that we do align and that they are currently working to align eligibility with the addition of a new child, so that there is some forward progress in that, but we are not there yet. An additional requirement is that online subsidy application options must be available, and that there be self-screening tools are encouraged. Right? So they're kind of two in one. Nebraska does meet that requirement for online subsidy applications. And we also, while not required, we do have self-screening tools through the iServe Nebraska portal.
Katie, a question here. I think it's regarding coordination with similar programs, but does that coordinate with child support information? Do you know that?
I do not know. My guess would be no. And the reason I would guess is that child support is not necessarily a public benefit in the same way, right? And this would be with other public benefit programs.
Okay. And then, so how long can the state actually use that waiver? Does the state need to show progress on reaching the CCDF final rule?
The state would be able to utilize that waiver until they submit their next CCDF state plan.
Okay.
Can I add something to that, Katie?
Please do.
So the only thing about the waiver, so the waiver again is only allowed for a 2-year period. States can apply for the full 2-year period unless they put an earlier expiration date on which they think that they can accomplish those changes by, which again would be reflected in what Katie mentioned, which would be their updated state plan.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So there were also some important miscellaneous and technical changes that we wanted to highlight because we do think that they are relevant. The first one is clarifications around background check requirements. Nebraska meets those background check requirements, so there are no significant changes there. The CCDF final rule also modifies the definition of major renovation to be based on the cost of the renovation as opposed to the type of renovation. So this would be for different grant programs. The definition of major renovation included things like structural changes. That is no longer a requirement. It is based on the dollar amount for the program, or excuse me, for the change. So let's talk about public input options. Right? As I mentioned at the start, there is a public hearing on June 24th, 2024, from 1 to 3 at the Nebraska State Office Building in the Meadowlark Conference Room, which is in the lower level. And I believe in the chat, you should have a link that will take you directly to this information so that you can get it if I go past it before you have a chance to write down this information. So one way to participate in the public comment is to attend the public hearing from 1 to 3. First Five Nebraska will have a representative at the public hearing. But we also know that childcare providers are frequently busy between 1 and 3 p.m. and attending attending in person is perhaps not the easiest option to accomplish, which is why public comment can also be submitted in writing. So you can submit comments in writing. They do have to be sent and received by June 24th at 5 p.m., which is a pretty quick turnaround, right? So if you do intend to take advantage of submitting written comment, I would encourage you to do that quite expediently to ensure that your comments are part of the public record and are taken into consideration as comments on the CCDF state plan. We did review the website. It does not look as though there is an online portal to submit those comments. So it does have to be in writing.
So a couple of questions regarding the public comment or the hearing. Will it be televised, either online or anything like that?
I do not know the answer to that. I can look for it, but I have not seen any indication that it will be. And in my previous experience, I have not seen a public hearing such as this to be televised.
And then if they live in Lincoln or the kind of real nearby, can they drop their written comments off?
I do believe that is an option. Yes, that's at the state building so that you could drop them off in person. They just need to be at this address.
Okay.
Wait here a moment and see, we did want to keep this to about 30 minutes because we know that for many of you, this is during the workday and you have children you need to take care of. But I'm happy to stay on, as is our First Five team members here, if you have other questions that we may be able to address.
One of the questions is how many items is Nebraska requesting a waiver for? And how long are they wanting the waivers to last?
Right. The state plan itself does not state how long the waiver is. So it is my understanding it's for the full 2 years, right? Yeah. But the wording is not in the state plan itself, that it would be 2 years, but that is what we understand. And it is for those items that I mentioned earlier around payment practices. The prospective payments, the attendance or the authorized enrollment instead of attendance. And there was one more, and I can't do it without flashing all the way back in my screen. So could you, somebody who has it up, remind me of the third one?
I can. The waiver itself is only allowable for certain provisions in the final rule. So it included, like Katie mentioned, the paying providers prospectively, the using enrollment instead of enrollment-based payment options, using grants or contracts for direct services for infants.
Thank you.
And then the other ones we've already are in compliance with, which was the capped at 7% of a family income and then consumer education requirement.
Yep.
And going up to an earlier question, Katie, regarding the either prospective payments or based on enrollment, was that was not part of a previous final rule, or was that just a COVID? Wasn't there a COVID temporary solution with that?
That was, yes, through the state that was done, but it was not part of the federal rules. It was never a requirement on the federal side before this new federal rule that took effect. I do want to say one more thing that I skipped past. We focused today on the changes in the federal rule. The CCDF state plan covers far more than what we covered in this webinar today. It also includes reimbursement rates. It includes how Nebraska organizes their licensing standards to meet CCDF requirements. It includes the health and safety standards and regulations that childcare providers have to meet at the federal level, and how Nebraska organizes those health and safety requirements. So there's far more in the CCDF state plan than what we discussed today. We were really focusing in on these new rule changes and how Nebraska is responding.
So is what would you say is First Five Nebraska's stance on the proposed plan? Or not the proposed plan, but just the final rule issued.
Elizabeth, I saw you come off mute, so I'm going to let you answer.
So we support the changes that have been outlined in the CCDF state plan, and we will write the letter saying that we support the changes, but that we would highly recommend and would like to work with the legislature and the state Department of Health and Human Services to get into compliance as fast as possible with the changes that have been implemented in the final rule. We know, especially the ones around payment practices, are going to have a huge impact on providers. And for us, the sooner that gets implemented, the better. We do know that we're going to have to work, honestly, with the legislature to find funding for it, because there, again, was not additional funding provided with these requirements. The states also only had 60 days to get into compliance. Based on our assessment of other states, we have not seen a state actually get into compliance within the 60-day requirement. Almost all the states that we have talked to, and again, we're still doing kind of an analysis, have requested this waiver because the requirement to get into compliance was so fast. And so our hope is that we will be able to, again, write the letter in support, but, notify the department that this is something that we need to see changes being made quickly.
So I'm going through these questions. Is it a given that the waiver will be granted, and does the legislature have options in deciding? I mean, is there a legislative option, I guess, instead of this?
Yes, you can force. The legislature can force states to get into compliance faster. They can write something into, again, state statute to do so. It's not common. For the most part, the state legislature does try to rely on the state government to use the federal government's guidelines to get into practice as quickly as they can, and to use whatever waivers they can do so to do so. I honestly am not sure if that would be an option, just because we do know, especially with the short turnaround, that there would need to be a significant amount of funding to make those requirements as quickly as maybe some folks would like. But then also too, I'm not sure what the appetite would be if the state government is already required to do so and has the flexibility to do so in a 2-year period.
And so do the rules expire in 2 years?
No, the federal rules will stay in perpetuity until there's a change to them, right? So they will continue to apply to forthcoming CCDF state plans.
And how does the state funding and federal CCDF, how are those blended, braided? Talk to that, would you?
Sure. So there is a set amount that states get or from the federal government, and then there is a required state match. In Nebraska, our funding for subsidy far exceeds our required state match. So a larger portion of the funding is state dollars than is federal dollars.
All right. Since the governor has said he's not clearing any new funding until his tax cuts are funded, is there a high risk that if this was approved that he'd get the funding anyway, like he did for child care employees receiving child care subsidy?
I can answer that question. No, if there was, I would say that's a tough question, Erica. I can't, unfortunately, we can't predict what would happen, but my assumption is that if there was, we do know, for instance, next year that there most likely will be some conversations around budget cuts. We do know that, again, the governor's priority is property taxes. If this was approved, we would have to get state funding one way or the other, but it is a federal requirement. And so one of the concerns, and I think the governor obviously would take this really seriously, is the fact that we could jeopardize federal funding if we don't get into state compliance. And so I don't think that he would gut this, because it would be something, again, that we would potentially lose federal dollars over. My assumption is that this is something the department is eager to work on and make sure that they get into compliance as fast as they can. The problem, though, is, as many know, that there's staffing shortages over there, there is funding shortages. And so that's something that First Hive is going to be prioritizing, is working with not only, obviously, the state government, but also the legislature to make sure that the funding is available, and that this, again, they can fill the staffing shortages and make the necessary changes in the 2-year requirement. And that's one thing, I guess, again, I would like to emphasize, is that it is only a 2-year waiver. States cannot ask for an extension, unlike previous waivers. So they have to come into compliance one way or the other.
And I guess from conversations with other states, we're not alone, right? I mean, it's the state of Nebraska is not alone in asking for these waivers. I guess I would want to reiterate that. Okay. If we don't get into alignment, isn't the consequence that funding for Healthy Start and other low-income subsidized programs will be held by the federal government? I wonder if that means Head Start.
I think there are some of those quality programs, right, as well. But yes, without getting into alignment, there is a risk of funding cuts, right, from the federal government. Not just a risk, that's the consequence.
Right. Jody, Renee, are you seeing any other comments on the other channel?
No, we don't have any questions from our Spanish speaking friends.
Would you like to put a plug in for having more engagement with yourself or me?
Yes, I did say it in the chat, but I just want to reiterate that uh, I want to encourage you that any outreach you do is going to be credible and professional and efficient and strategic. And if you have any question at all about or just nervousness, wanting just a second pair of eyes or some help writing your message, crafting it that way, Fekin and I are completely at your disposal. We absolutely love helping advocates feel powerful. And so please feel free to reach out to either of us.
So I think that, and speaking with advocacy, this is a great question. How important is in-person testimony versus written testimony? And maybe testimony is a strong word here, but public comment. Because I do think that maybe a distinction needs to be made that this is a public, a public comment hearing, and this is not like a typical hearing that First Five Nebraska, as far as the legislature hearing. Elizabeth or
Are you
Katie?
waiting for me to answer that? I was waiting for Elizabeth to see if she wanted to chime in first.
I would say, if it's possible, and I know that everybody has a busy schedule, but if it is possible, in-person public comments, again, would be the most effective. I think that if you are able to write your comments and mail them in, that's great. But this is one of the most substantial changes that we have seen to the CCDF regs in a while. And it is something that's going to have the most impact for providers. I noticed a comment earlier that said we'll probably lose a lot of providers because and low-income families that need subsidy over the next 2 years. And that's true. We probably will, because certain changes like this need to take action in order for us to, again, fully create equitable childcare system that supports all. And so in-person public comments, again, stressing the concerns that you have, emphasizing those payment practices and having those go into compliance as fast as possible, prioritizing that and making your comments known, I think would be much appreciated. And honestly, I think that they would really enjoy hearing from folks like yourself more than they would enjoy hearing from folks like staff at First Five Nebraska. They much rather hear people on the ground and how this is going to impact them.
So to Robert's question, are we looking for we support this plan or do a opposition to challenges to it?
I think you use we're not going to tell you how you should write the letter. I think, I know, Robert, you're like, oh, bummer. But look, one of the things, though, that, again, we want to emphasize is that this, Nebraska has done some pretty good things. I mean, we already did cap it at 7% co-payments for families. Most other states didn't. We do have a lot of information on the consumer education already on our website, and a lot of states didn't. I don't want to bog down our concerns with the waivers and not, again, emphasize the great things that our state has done. And so that's, again, how we at First Five Nebraska are going to be drafting the letter, by saying, we really appreciate all the successes and the changes that have already been made and how Nebraska has implemented those changes. But we would encourage and really want to see the other, payment practices specifically come into compliance as fast as possible. My hope, honestly, is that we don't use the full 2 years. My hope is that we can do it quicker. And that's something that First Five Nebraska will be working on, is to get it done as fast as we can and be as supportive to the department as much as we can.
All right. And so with that, I think we did go a little bit over time, so we kind of apologize, but that was a lot of stuff to get through. And so I guess if there are not any more questions, then I want to thank everyone for attending today. And we want to thank Dr. Katie Bass for walking us through that. We want to thank Elizabeth Everett for a lot of those clarifying big ticket items there. We also want to thank B. Torres for our language justice and our interpretation services. I'm going to thank myself for being so awesome, and want to thank Jody Renee Giron for being awesome. And I think, just thank everybody for also being so awesome on the call. So thank you very much. Medwick, wherever you're at. I can't see on my screen. Want to thank you. So everybody, I guess from everyone at First Five Nebraska, we want to thank you, and let's get those comments in, and hopefully you enjoyed our webinar today. But keep looking forward. Make sure that you see or that you are subscribed to our newsletter so that you can see other opportunities like this as we as we continue down for next year's session, but then also for our legislative hearings that will be coming up at the end of the year as well. So, all right, I think that's it. You guys can leave. Thanks a lot, everybody.